Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you, Philippe, for hosting this very interesting event. I'm really very, very pleased to be with you today. I think that given the nature of the comments which I'm about to make, it is especially appropriate and fitting that I'm actually speaking to a global audience located in many different parts of the world, because I think that some of the issues that I will raise are of interest, across all time zones, across all nations, across all members of the human family. I don't think I will say anything that would surprise you if I will say that we're going through a very critical time in human history, where all kinds of questions are being raised about the future of humanity. There is a great deal of concern about the risks that we face as a human family. If I were to ask you to make a list of some of these global challenges that we face, that cast a shadow over the future of all of us, we would all make a very long list. I'll share 3 or so that worry me. And then after I do that, I will share with you some ideas as to what could be one possible way in which we could perhaps more meaningfully confront these risks. One issue of concern is what is happening on the climate change side. As you well know, in 2015, we had an agreement, the Paris Agreement on climate change, which was an important threshold because it was an admission on the part of more than 190 countries that we had a serious problem to confront that threatened our future. But of course, as you know, emissions have continued to rise. We are making increasingly intense use of energy. And I think that there is both agreement that the Paris Agreement, is not working. It is not delivering the results that we needed, which is perhaps the reason why it led to James Hansen, one of the leading scientists of climate change over the last several decades, to issue a report in February of this year, in which he said that the 2-degree centigrade target implicit in the Paris Agreement is gone. It is not going to happen. He thought that by 2045, if not sooner, we would breach that target, and that this would bring about, untold consequences for all of us. Sea level rise, extreme weather events, all of this with implications for, our ecosystem. So here we have a huge problem which needs addressing, and we don't seem to have found the mechanisms to address this problem in a way that allows us to find solutions. I'm very concerned about the very fragile security situation in the world, the rise of militarism and deep-seated nationalisms, which have caused so much damage to us in the last 100 years. We all hope that this is not going to lead to a future conflict in which nuclear weapons are going to be used, because that would be, needless to say, devastating for our future. But the fact is that, contrary to the understandings that were reached in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, nations, especially the nuclear powers, are modernizing their arsenals. They're investing close to $100 billion per year, adding to those arsenals. And this, raises fundamental questions about what the path that we're following of increasing defense spending and, conflicts in more than 50 places around the world. And then finally, not to make this list too long, I am an economist and I remain concerned about vulnerabilities in the global financial system. As you know, public indebtedness has become a huge issue, not just in the developing countries, but also in some of the large industrial countries. Debt levels in many of the large high-income countries in the world, including the United States, are at wartime levels last seen at the end of World War II. And of course, we don't have a war just yet. And this is concerning because it limits our options. It reduces the fiscal space that we have to deal with the transition to a green economy, to deal with poverty, to deal with inequality, and so on. All right. The last time that we made a serious attempt at modernizing or restructuring our global governance architecture was in 1945 with the adoption of the United Nations Charter. And I'd like to take you just for 1 minute to the June 26th, the closing day of the San Francisco conference where the UN Charter was adopted. At that conference, President Truman said something which I think encapsulates a very important principle. He was referring to the charter. I have a copy of it here in my hand. He was saying that this document would be a living document, that it would not be fixed in time, that it would be adapted to changing world circumstances. In fact, he said that like the US Constitution, which by 1945 had been amended more than 20 times, the UN Charter would also be amended and be relevant at every stage of our history as conditions in the world change. This is a very important principle, and as institutions adapt, they die, they become increasingly irrelevant. But of course, as you know, the United Nations Charter has not been amended during the 80-year history of the UN. You know, I'd like to share with you the words of today, somebody would be called a civil society organization leader. His name was Shoghi Effendi. He was the head of the Baha'i community, which is a very friendly, very open religious community. In 1931, he was surveying the very difficult time through which we were going in the context of the global depression. And he said the following. He said, the fundamental cause of world unrest is our failure to adjust our system of economic and political institutions to the imperative needs of a rapidly evolving age. Again, the same principle to which Truman referred to at the closing of the San Francisco conference. Institutions need to adapt to remain relevant. All right, so that brings me to my next point, which is the following. The Global Governance Forum 3 years ago convened a group of experts, leading experts, former UN officials, former ministers and policymakers, essentially with the idea of beginning a process where we would ask ourselves, if we needed to bring the UN Charter into the 21st century, to turn the UN system into a problem-solving organization, to empower the United Nations to allow us to confront the challenges of today, as I have described a few minutes ago, what would that look like? So in 2023, during General Assembly Week in New York, we released a report which made the case for amending the UN Charter, which laid out the intellectual arguments for why we needed to bring this document in keeping with the promise of President Truman into the 21st century. We released that document, and it was immediately endorsed by 20 Nobel laureates, and a declaration that we released at the same time was very rapidly signed on by hundreds of prominent people, including former heads of state, prime ministers, heads of civil society organizations, and so on. Having done that, then in September of 2024, last year, just 2 days before the Summit of the Future, we rose to the challenge and released a copy of a second United Nations Charter. I have a copy here, which I will show you the cover of, although this document is also on the website of the Global Governance Forum. On the homepage, it's a PDF file which you can download. And in this document, we basically made an effort, an honest, courageous, ambitious, and ultimately humble effort to come up with a vision of what that UN Charter would look like. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is just to give you a sense of the flavor of what we have done. Because I think, since I'm speaking to a global audience, I'd like to whet your appetite. I'd like to encourage you to go to the website of the Global Governance Forum and download the document and read it yourself. There are three kinds of changes that we propose in our amended version of the UN Charter. First, the easy part, we were dealing with legacy updates. There are parts of the original UN Charter which are completely defunct. They no longer are relevant. In this document, there are a few chapters that deal with the Trusteeship Council, which was a system that was put in place when the UN was created to deal with the process of decolonization. But the last such territory became a member of the United Nations in 1994. It is Palau. And with that, the work of that council came to an end. And so it is possible to take the charter, to take all those chapters out because they no longer have any operational meaning. Then, of course, the charter has references to enemy states. You know, countries like Germany and Japan, which in the post-war period, once they became members, have been very strong supporters of the UN. They have borne a lot of the burden of the budget and financial contributions. And to us, it is a total travesty that these countries should continue to be referred in this document as enemy states. That is something that can be taken out. It's non-controversial. Nobody would oppose it. It is a reflection of today's reality. Then what we did is we introduced other kinds of changes which we could characterize as normative advances. Let me tell you what I mean by normative advances. The whole question of human rights, for instance. Human rights are explicitly mentioned in the 1945 Charter. They are recognized, and that was an important achievement, and it was followed in 1948 by the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which itself was a very important development, which then led to a number of conventions and so on, which made a remarkable improvement in the legal framework for human rights all over the world. And that has to be celebrated as an important achievement of the UN. However, in the 21st century, we live in a world in which many nation states, even states which have adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, do not abide by its principles and are indeed violators of human rights and commit all kinds of other abuses. Iran is a very good example of that. It is a country that discriminates against religious minorities. It discriminates against half of its population, namely its women. The person who introduced me today mentioned that I had spent some time as the director of one of the research groups at the World Bank. And I can tell you, at the World Bank, we built up a database which identifies something like 27 different forms of discrimination against women in Iran embedded in the laws of those countries. And so in the second charter, what we're trying to do is, first of all, we create a Human Rights Council and dedicate to it an entire new chapter in the revised charter, because we want to create a situation in which states are no longer able to just play lip service to the notion of human rights, while at the same time committing all kinds of violations, which are a violation of those principles. This kind of gap between the lofty principles and words on the one hand, and the realities lived by people on the ground, religious minorities, ethnic groups, women, all kinds of other peoples that are discriminated against. We want to narrow that gap, and ultimately we want to eliminate it. So there is a match between the lofty ideals and the principles on the one hand, and the realities on the other. We create an Earth System Council, a new council within the UN system to deal with the issue of climate change. The 1945 Charter is pre-nuclear age, it is pre-climate, it is pre-digital. It is a document which was an important step in the right direction back in 1945, but it is simply not adequate to deal with the challenges of today. And then, of course, beyond that, there are what I call the structural innovation or the structural changes which we're proposing in the new charter to deal with a host of other issues that the UN is playing with. Here, I can give you a few examples. whenever you talk about reforming the UN these days, very often the first item that comes to people's mind is the question of the Security Council. It is broadly understood, universally accepted, that the Security Council is a completely dysfunctional body because of the veto power. The veto power has paralyzed the Council. It has undermined its moral authority, and it has really contributed in a big way to undermine the credibility of the organization. Beyond the veto, the Security Council also has a problem of representation. We have countries like Japan, like India, like Brazil, like Germany, who get to serve on the Security Council every few years, whereas countries like the United Kingdom, France, and the other permanent members have been sitting on it since 1945 without interruption. This may have made sense back in the 1940s and the 1950s, but today, think of it, India is rapidly emerging as the third largest economy in the world, at least on a PPP basis, for those of you familiar with the jargon. It is the most populous nation on earth. It has overtaken China in terms of the numbers of people back in 1923 or 24, as I remember. And yet, India is not does not have a regular presence and participation in the debates around security issues. So we have come up with proposals in the charter that address the issue of representation and address the issue of the veto. Because of the timing constraints, I don't have time to go into the details, and I would like to mention a couple of other of the reforms that we're proposing by way of wrapping up my commentary. The United Nations, as it was conceived in 1945, is an organization of states. Although, ironically, the very first words on page 1, literally, of the United Nations are "we the peoples." And so there is always been a kind of a tension. People have referred to this as a lack of democratic legitimacy on the part of the United Nations. Albert Einstein, back in 1946, wrote a letter to the General Assembly saying, instead of having diplomats representing their governments on the General Assembly, these people should be elected directly by the people in their own respective countries. And he argued that in this way, the UN would be closer to the people and representing their interests rather than just the interests of the political parties back at home. So in our second charter, we are turning the United Nations into an organization of states and peoples through the creation of a parliamentary assembly as a kind of a second chamber in what would then be an enhanced organization. We think that the experience of the European Union in this respect is very, very useful. Back in 1958, the European Parliamentary Assembly was established among the 6 member states of founding member states of the European Union. As you know, it's a very interesting story. By 1979, the European Parliamentary Assembly turned into a European Parliament, which was directly elected in the member nations of the European Union and has acquired legislative capacities in those areas in which it makes sense to legislate at the European level. We are inspired by that experience, and we have therefore come up with proposals which create a United Nations where a parliamentary assembly representing the people, which can either be members of the national parliaments or directly elected up to the countries, would bring a degree of democratic legitimacy to the UN system. I'm looking at my watch, and I have a couple of more minutes left, and I'd like to give you one more example, and then to have a kind of a closing word. In the proposals that we put forward, we come up with new ways of electing the Secretary General. At the moment, as you know, this is a process which, again, is increasingly lacks credibility because the permanent members of the Security Council have veto power on the election of the Secretary General, it has led to a process where, in fact, we tend to go for the lowest common denominator, the person who is acceptable to all members of the Security Council. Then they send one name to the General Assembly because the original charter says that it is the General Assembly that elects the Secretary General, and the General Assembly has to rubber stamp this one choice sent by the permanent members. We are considerably amending that proposal, those mechanisms. In our new system, we think that the Security Council should send a number of names to the General Assembly. The General Assembly should vote on these names. It should zero in on the 5 top candidates. They should be sent to the Parliamentary Assembly, and the Parliamentary Assembly gets the final say and gives the Secretary General a non-renewable 7-year term, because we think that it is very important for the Secretary General to have independence, not to be thinking about what he needs to do in order to get renewed for a second term in office. No, he will not be renewed. He will get to serve a period of 7 years, and therefore he will be empowered to speak truth to power and to have the kind of independence that is absolutely necessary in today's world. Let me conclude by saying that we have offered this second charter in a spirit of humility. What do I mean by that? I mean to say that we think that coming up with a 21st century United Nations Charter will involve broad consultation among member states, among civil societies. So this charter is a contribution to that future consultation. We think that the time has come for member states of the United Nations to call for an Article 109 conference. The original charter actually has an article in it which opens the way for possible review of the charter. It was introduced to placate the member countries who were opposed to the veto. So the General Assembly and the members of the Security Council can call for a review conference. It is not a proposal that can be vetoed, and we can begin that conversation as to what kind of charter we need in the 21st century, so that the United Nations become a catalyst to help us address the multiple problems that we face in the world today. If we don't do something like this, if we continue to live in a world in which we recognize problems, but otherwise are complacent about solutions to these problems, like what we're doing to climate change, like what we're doing with disarmament and weapons and so on, then we potentially face a very dark future. And we want to prevent a situation where the next time that we review our global governance architecture is after some kind of calamity, after some kind of global conflict, a world war, God forbid, an acceleration of climate change. We don't want to find ourselves in that situation, because by then it is too late and the cost will be too high. There will be too much human suffering, too much dislocation, and we must avoid that scenario at all costs. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Philippe, again, for the kind invitation. It has been a pleasure to speak to you today, and I wish you well in the remaining part of your proceedings.